So it started when I went to the big fortified tasting in London about 4 or 5 years ago, and I came across a wine called Carcavelos, which I had not heard of before. And I spoke to the guy who was pouring the wine, and he told me the story, which is that it's a very small fortified wine appellation near Lisbon. And it was some years ago in danger of being completely wiped out by urban development. And it sounded like a fascinating story. And I spoke to a few people who really didn't know anything about it. And then I looked online and could only really find 2 or 3 stories. One of which was a discussion on a wine forum. Another was a blog. Another was a booklet that had been written, but it was in Portuguese. And I felt like it was a story that needed to be told again. So I actually visited there last year, and with the intention of writing the piece that I entered into the competition. I also intended to create it using the particular platform, which involves a lot of video and sort of photography intertwined with the words. So I had a vision for what I wanted it to be, and I intended to write this story of a little known struggling appellation that makes really interesting, very unusual wines. And so bringing it hopefully to a wider audience. So I wrote it independently. It wasn't commissioned. I didn't intend to sell it to anywhere. I just wanted to put this piece online, to use this platform and to tell the story. I funded the trip myself, and I found it very beneficial and interesting. Whether it could have been part of a printed magazine, an editorial commission, I think it certainly had the potential to be, but it would have made a quite difficult pitch, I think. Even though the story is interesting, it's such an obscure wine, and it requires a great deal of explanation. It's not the kind of name that will grab people's attention, potentially, to sell copies. So I always intended it to be a piece of independent work. So I think digital wine communication is still as exciting, although I believe that the role of social media is changing, possibly for the worse. And specifically with Twitter, there seems to be a reduction in its importance, its relevance. Although perhaps that's slightly offset by mediums like Instagram, which I think is getting more important and more interesting. And then also social apps such as Vivino, which I think are doing a really great and interesting job of connecting wine people together. The thing that I've always found brilliant about digital communication of any sort is its immediacy, and that hasn't changed. If anything, that's got better because it's gone mobile, and generally speaking, connection, whether it's Wi-Fi or 4G, is more available pretty much wherever you go these days. So I think that is its key benefit, being able to react instantly, to share things, or to write about things. The platform I used for my entry is called Shorthand, and that's a free blogging platform which uses a pretty basic template, but which you can be very creative with. So you can add in video, images, and text. But the way that the page works, it's a dynamic full page blogging platform that allows you to integrate all those different media in a way that I think is much more creative than the standard kind of WordPress platform. The disadvantage is that it stands on its own in its own domain, so you can't easily embed it into your own blog. That means they control, the analytics data, and also, there's less immediate control over how it's distributed, who gets to see it, and so on. But despite that, it's free apart from anything else, and it's a bit like Medium.com. That it's a place to go to find interesting stories that have been put on a platform specifically because it is a great way of telling a story. So I think that is something that deserves better exposure. And it'll be interesting to see if there are further developments with that sort of standalone platform in the next few years. So I think for anyone trying to get into wine writing, there are a few pieces of general advice which you probably will hear a lot, such as be realistic. It's not an easy way to make money. Have your own voice. Don't try and imitate somebody else's style. Enter competitions. I would say that all of the competitions that run within wine writing are a really valuable way to practice and also to judge your own writing alongside other people that are shortlisted and winning prizes. And it also gives a deadline, which is a really good motivation to produce a particular piece of work. Whether you should specialize or not, I think should be a personal choice. Most people would recommend specializing, I believe, because it gives you a better niche, a better angle. I've never specialized, and I've managed to stay as a generalist and have some reasonable success with that. So it's definitely possible. The other thing I would say, which I don't think most people do, is ask other writers. When I started out, I asked lots of writers how they got started, whether they could help me, even whether I could spend an hour with them and chat over a glass of wine about what my options are. I don't think people do that anywhere near enough, and most wine writers are generally quite friendly and willing to, very willing to talk about themselves, funnily enough. So if you are serious about it, then you can get an awful lot of insight from discussing wine writing with other wine writers. So governments are definitely a really important influence. In the UK, there is a sense of anti-alcohol measures being taken, and consumption seems to be at best plateauing and possibly even falling. And I think that is, those two things are related. So governments are most certainly an influence, an important influence on how wine is consumed. Otherwise, I see trends changing quite a lot, and there's understandable concern about how climate change will affect what can be produced where. Yet, I still believe that most regions are able to adapt and change, perhaps having to change their planting, but more realistically to change their farming habits and their vinification habits in order to make the best wine they can given their circumstances. So we may see some slight changes in styles around the world, but I don't think that's a bad thing. And that has happened throughout history as the wine world has evolved and people have become more used to their circumstances and changing tastes and changing trends. So I think moderation means different things to different people. And this is one of the reasons why it's so difficult to establish recommended drinking guidelines, for example. I would probably define moderation as the limit to how much you can drink without causing harm to yourself or to others. And that is going to vary from person to person and even just from circumstance to circumstance. I think most people that enjoy alcohol and are able to do so responsibly are aware of that limit, and therefore can moderate themselves. Whereas if you look at government guidelines, whether that's in the UK or around the world, it's impossible to find something which is applicable to everyone. And so it's very difficult, therefore, to, as a wine communicator, to get behind that message wholeheartedly, because it is very limiting. In terms of the health implications, there's no question that alcohol can be harmful to health, of course. Whether it can be beneficial to health is, I think, a really important and relevant discussion to have. My belief is that whether it is or not, and the evidence appears to me completely contradictory when you look at various studies, claiming that alcohol can have health benefits is not a suitable way to proceed for the wine industry. We have been using the argument that, for example, red wine can reduce the risk of heart attacks and so on for many, many years, and it hasn't done us any favors. It's just so much more apparent that alcohol can be harmful than it is for alcohol to be beneficial. So trying to win an argument on health terms is, I believe, completely inadvisable, and that we should focus on supporting a message of responsible consumption so that we are not subject to legislation that then comes to really restrict the possibilities for our industry. So firstly, you have to segment consumers. That's really important. If you're talking about the standard supermarket consumer, then retailers have got most of the power. The discounters, Aldi and Lidl, for example, are having great success with their wine ranges. What they choose and the prices they achieve in their stores are no doubt having a strong influence on the choices people make when they're going to buy wine. If you're then talking about more engaged wine drinkers, I think it's from a wide range of influence. There are critics, although it seems to me that the influence of critics is diminishing slightly. Of course, friends and family always have a strong influence on people's choices. And then there's social media, and that's the thing that's come out more recently, whether it is searching Facebook or Twitter for wine reviews or seeing what your friends have posted, or whether you're using a more specific type of platform such as a label scanning app. These are really creative and influential ways that you can help wine lovers to find interesting new things. And the same would go for sommeliers and wine merchants. You know, they've got the power to talk to their customers and introduce them to new trends, new interesting things. But of course, that's only relevant to a relatively small percentage of wine drinkers, who, of course, spend a lot more than the majority of wine drinkers. So it's a really split market for consumers, and the relevance will be different for each part. Well, I started in wine writing 100% digital. and have never published a book. So I'm inclined to say that you can do it without needing those traditional forms. I still write for print magazines, and I still want to, and I think they have a certain degree of credibility that sometimes online writing lacks, and that's ultimately down to this, editing, a sense of something being curated. I think books are still always and always will be relevant. I studied wine books for my Master of Wine research paper, and the patterns I see are that more and more and more are being published. The question is whether there is comparable quality between those books, especially the self-published ones. So I think while books are certainly, having a tangible book with your name on it about your subject is definitely beneficial, self-publishing any old book is not. It does not make sense to throw together a badly produced, unedited piece of written work. So I think the two can coexist, and I'm sure most wine writers would love the idea of having a successful book, but there's no reason that you can't succeed digitally. I will be continuing to write for jansisrobinson.com and for my own blog and a few print publications here and there, as well as some consulting work, judging work, teaching work, and so on. I am launching a new project in March next year, which I can't say anything about at the moment, but it's in collaboration with another wine communicator, and we are quite excited about its potential. So that's coming out in March. And otherwise, I'm going to be doing more of the same, including entering wine writing competitions.